Hello and welcome to part 2 of European Medicine Part 1 lecture, and against the backdrop of the types of diseases that we saw and the population changes that we saw and the types of hygiene that were practiced in the Middle Ages, we now step into what did medicine look like in the Middle Ages and what was happening with that. So this was, as I've mentioned, a period of greatly slowed progress in the development of medicine. It was generally a time of decline in scholarly activity altogether as compared to the Greco-Roman period, and the church really had a great deal of influence with regard to ideas such as illness being the result of punishment from God for sins, and this had some similarity to other cultures and other spiritualities previous to that, with regard to, for example, in the Greco-Roman period, displeasure of the gods being the cause of illness, but we're now down to one God at this point, and the idea of sin as opposed to just having displeased the gods in some way. So that perhaps being a bit more codified into the religion of the period. And we have Galenic theory, the four humors, dominating still in medical thought and practice for the entirety of the Middle Ages. So there was no shift out of that idea of the four humors and the balancing of the four humors, or the draining of particular humors in excess as the approach to treatment. So the main focus at this point in time was on diagnosing and treating, and not discovering the cause of illness. So despite the fact that the church might have been influencing things by saying that illnesses were the result of punishment by God for sins, the main focus of medicine was really about diagnosing and treating illness and not really delving into the cause. And the diagnosis and treatment was focused on balancing the humors, and treatments were generally herbs and potions, oftentimes more drastic treatments such as bloodletting, purgatives, and emetics that were used to drain an excess humor. And those that believed that sin was the cause of illness would also take measures such as self-flagellation to repent their sins as a treatment for illness. Treatment by healing agents of the Christian church was considered a freely given act of charity at that point in time. And so, for example, those receiving medical treatment in the monasteries, those were free treatments. And treatment for illnesses included things like laying on of the hands, prayer, requesting miracles, exorcisms, and confession of sins. So again, religion very much intertwined with the treatment at that point in time. Astrology also played a really strongly increasing role, both in the determination of diagnosis and the determination of the proper treatment for an illness. And hygiene also played a role, and as doctors did prescribe things like steam and cold or herbal baths at that point in time. The image on this slide harkens to the role of astrology, and this is an image of the zodiac, which is overlaid on an anatomical chart from the early 1400s, and you can see how the different symbols of the different astrological signs are overlaid over different parts of the anatomy, and those were the relationships that were seen there. We will just touch back for a few minutes on Arabic scholarship being the bridge of information, the way that information was conveyed from the Greco-Roman world into the Western European scientific and medical world of the Middle Ages. So Arabic scholarship, again, and medical thought was flourishing from about 600 to about 1000 of the Common Era, and that's at the same time that European medicine was quite stagnant. And Arabic scholars were translating and preserving earlier Greco-Roman texts and bringing that knowledge into Spain, predominantly on an influx of physicians in the mid-700s into Spain. And you might remember from our last lecture that southern Spain in particular was held by the Islamic Empire from that period of time around the mid-700s. And so there was a migration of Islamic knowledge into the southern part of what we now call Europe through that influence. And Arabic scholars were keeping to the Galenic theories and practices, and we talked about Rhazes and Avicenna in our last lecture. And there was no human dissection on religious grounds, and so there was little progress with anatomy. And again, they were really focusing on pharmacology and pharmacy being advanced by the Arabic scholars beyond the prior work of Dioscorides in the Greco-Roman period. So I won't go into too much more detail because we did just study this in our last lecture, but just to remind us that this was the bridge that was happening while this period of the early Middle Ages was this period of stagnation in European medical thought. This is when all of the robust Arabic, Persian, Islamic intellectual thought around medicine was going on, and the development particularly of chemistry. Then we come to a period around 1000 of the Common Era when Europe starts to become more robust in the scholarship around medicine. And the world's first medical school was founded around 1000 of the Common Era at Salerno, Italy. It was directed by the Catholic Church, and the teachers were both priests and secular scholars. And you'll recall in the last part of this lecture I was saying that in the monasteries that was where a lot of the knowledge was being translated, and medical books were being copied, and there was a lot of scholarship within the church in terms of the preservation of medical knowledge. And so we had priests serving as scholars in medical university at this point. The medical university in Salerno was very eclectic and very liberal for the times. There were both male and female students, and there were students from Greek, Jewish, Arabic, Latin, and European backgrounds. So we had this real melding of scholarship from different cultures happening at Salerno. And this is sort of similar to 1,000 years prior, the mixing that was happening at Alexandria, at the Library of Alexandria at that time. So the image on this slide is of the Scuola Medica Salernitana, which is the name of the medical school in Salerno. And it was primarily Galenic medical theory that was being taught then, but it migrated backward a bit towards Hippocratic teachings in order to renew those ideas a little bit. So going back and picking up some of Hippocrates' teachings that had not been really adopted by Galen. And human dissection, again, was not being practiced, and that was because there were Islamic teachers in this university and other religious considerations, but there were animals being used for dissection at that point in time. There were female graduates from this medical university, but it wasn't clear whether they were meant to just go and treat women and attend childbirth as a focus of their practice, or whether they had a broader scope to their practice. What was clear at that point in time was that women were at some point relegated to being just midwives and attending childbirth as their predominant interaction in terms of mainstream medical practice beyond just the wise woman tradition. And I guess that's worth pointing out here that we do still have the traditional medicines, the folk medicines of Europe, widely being practiced across all of Europe at this point in time. The first female professor of medicine in recorded history was here, and her name was Trotula of Ruggiero. She was a renowned physician and obstetrician, and she wrote a number of standard medical texts in gynecology that were used for several centuries in medical education. She had a Hippocratic style of medicine with a focus on diet and regular physical activity and hygiene. And in this first university, this was the first time that graduates in Europe were recognized by the state. The focus of study was on theory and rhetoric and philosophy, and the graduates were afforded a greater amount of prestige than lay healers at that point in time. The cost of hiring a physician that was graduated from this university or later similar universities was very high. However, the practical aspects of medicine were not really considered to have intellectual standing, so they weren't really included in medical education, including surgery. So you had these doctors or physicians being trained in university, and the focus was primarily theory and philosophy and not practice. However, after they graduated, if you wanted to hire them as your doctor, the cost of that was quite high, and they didn't have a lot of practical experience in terms of actual clinical medicine. So that's just an interesting kind of juxtaposition of it just seems quite ironic. This, as a side note, since we've touched on women in medicine, we'll also touch on the role of women in society in the Middle Ages. Women were officially required to be under the control of a man, a father, a husband, or a brother, and they had little latitude in how they spent their time, which was really in the household. This was perhaps a sign of the patriarchal nature of the church during this period of time, and it lasted for some centuries after the end of the medieval period as well. The other option for a woman was to become a nun and to come under the direction of the church. And so when this is considered, the existence of the female professor of medicine and female students of medicine in this first medical school is really quite extraordinary. Medicine became more formalized during the Middle Ages, and shortly after, I say shortly, 100 or so years after the establishment of this first university, we start seeing regulation of medicine. So in 1140, King Roger of Sicily, this is again in Italy that this is happening, declared the practice of medicine could not be undertaken without formal qualifications, including passing examinations that were set by the university. And about 100 years later, his grandson, King Frederick II, ruled further that medical training has to consist of 5 years of formal studies and a further year of supervised practice to become eligible to sit the qualifying exams. And so this is a quite similar structure to what persists into this day and age in medicine at this point in time. The image on the slide here is King Roger II of Sicily, and he's receiving his crown from Christ. So the kings at this point in time were, in some sense, religiously ordained or divinely ordained. This is then the beginning of the professionalization or the institutionalization of medicine, though it took many years for this formalization of the profession to spread to other countries around Europe. So this is focused in Italy at this point. It created a divide with university-trained doctors serving the wealthy in cities and lay practitioners, mostly monks or lay healers, attending the less wealthy or the rural populations in more traditional ways of healing. And so we had this bifurcation of medicine that has now become very strongly established, at least in Italy at this time, and that spread. So also in the 1100s, another medical school opened, the Catholic University of Bologna, which was the first to incorporate human dissection into study soon after it was established. So this is a major point of development in the study of medicine, even if it took quite some time for the anatomical knowledge that was gained to actually get a foothold and become practically useful in medicine. The first known treatise on dissection was written by one of the anatomy teachers at this Catholic university in 1316. So you see it's 200 years hence from the beginning of that university before that first anatomical treatise was published. And the first printed edition was published in 1487. It persisted in use as an anatomical text until the more accurate text published in 1543 by Vesalius, and we'll talk more about Vesalius later in this session and a further part of this session. The third medical school was set up in Padua in 1222, but it didn't incorporate human dissection until 1341. So we see this advent of human dissection slowly gaining ground, even against the prohibition of the church in that regard. And Padua eventually became the new center of anatomical study, with a major influence on the knowledge base of medicine from that place. Medical schools then after that began to proliferate more widely, and in the late 14th century, the dogma of Galenic medicine had eased just a little bit, and medical scholars were dissecting and debating the prior knowledge and correcting errors that Galen had made in anatomy, which I've mentioned previously. But the texts themselves remained much as they were for a long time, and so the errors in the texts didn't get corrected very quickly, and they kept being used. Despite the institutional developments, though, the end of the Middle Ages left the realm of medicine pretty much where we left it at the end of the Roman Empire, and that was with Galenic theory and practice of the humoral diagnosis and treatment firmly in place. So the practice, the tangible practice of medicine was still very much rooted in the manipulation of the humors, or the draining of humors in excess as a treatment and as a diagnostic framework. And the beginning of the Europeans' migration into the Americas, it would soon also become firmly ingrained in the medical system in the Americas as well. So this was very much what medicine was throughout this period of time. On the other hand, we now have monks and apothecaries and lay healers practicing more traditional forms of medicine outside of these intellectual centers at the universities. General people, lay people, believed in both magical, supernatural, and physical causes of illness. The monasteries had extensive medicinal herb gardens, and monks were educated to use them, and they educated themselves oftentimes by collecting knowledge from written texts that they were then set to copy because they were the scribes of the culture, and they did a lot of learning through that method. And apothecaries were also in existence, particularly in rural areas, but also in cities, that sold herbs and drugs. And again, I'm using drugs in this historical context to mean combinations of different remedies, not chemical pharmacological agents like we think of a drug now. And lay healers were generally wise women or cunning men, which we have covered in our prior lecture on European folk medicine in the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon tradition. So this kind of medicine was available to those who generally couldn't afford diagnosis and treatment from a qualified doctor or had no doctor nearby, because the doctors, the properly trained doctors, were they didn't have a lot of practical knowledge beyond the theoretical knowledge that they got in the universities, but they also weren't widely spread outside the cities. So this is most of the population that is still accessing this traditional healing, whether it's from a wise woman or cunning man in their community, from a woman within their household, or from a monk within their region. So we'll talk more about monks and monasteries and monastic medicine on the next slide. But the important thing here is that for the non-wealthy average person, all of these potential sources of medicine and care were a blend in the rural areas. And many monks used the theory of the four humors to diagnose and treat, while even qualified doctors use magical charms. And so you weren't assured better care by being attended by someone who was formally trained. And herbs were often given more for their magical qualities than for their physical or physiological effects. The knowledge of and use of astrology and astronomy were still common at this point in time, especially in diagnosis of illness. And as an example, the cause of the plague was seen by some to be an alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius, along with the individual weaknesses or blockages in the digestion. So they were looking at individual causes along with these celestial causes. The availability of both formal education and the monks and apothecaries had really limited influence rurally, and the average person was generally continuing with herbal remedies that had been passed down amongst family and friends over time, and consulting with local lay healers. On to monastic medicine, which I have mentioned a couple of times prior to this, and we'll talk just a little bit more about that now. So in the monasteries, herbal medicine really developed and evolved over time. It was a great wealth of herbal knowledge was developing within the monasteries. Monks were educated, and they were engaged in basic experimentation, what we might consider to be science now, to determine the best remedies for different disease patterns. And they were also quite accomplished botanists. They took significant time to care for medicinal herb gardens, and they cultivated non-local medicinal herbs. So there were herbs that were coming in from other locations around the world through the exploration that was going on at this point in time. And explorers would bring plants back from other areas, along with sometimes knowledge about how those plants were used by native cultures in healing. And the monasteries were places where these herbs were actually cultivated. And so that knowledge was propagated into European culture, as well as care being given to those plants to help keep them going for their medicinal uses. So monks maintained their extensive medicinal herb gardens in what was a developing method of what we would call botany today. We think of them as botanists, but that wasn't necessarily a profession at that point in time, or a system of science at that point in time. And they took really significant time and a lot of spirit in caring for their plants. And they utilized texts and added to the writings on herbal medicines through their experiences with these plants. They also utilized trade to obtain herbs that weren't locally native. So they might learn about a herb from a text that they were translating, and then they would seek out that herb and seek to bring it into their medicinal gardens so that they would be able to use it. And so they were really expanding on local systems of medicine through all of this. They also really incorporated pagan and folk medicine in their traditional local remedies. And so they engaged in basic experimentation through what they learned from the prior folk uses of medicine in the region. And the monks might have come, they might have migrated from some distant place. And they came in and they learned the local culture and the local folk medicine and how to use the local plants. They also adopted Greco-Roman health traditions, and they constructed infirmaries that included baths, latrines, steam rooms, and cold rooms, despite the fact that most Greco-Roman traditions were being lost in Western Europe with the Germanic influx there. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, the Christian Mediterranean cities began to migrate back towards Roman sanitary practices, and we started to see an increase in hygiene at that point in time. And now we will talk about the first of our luminaries of medicine in the Middle Ages. And perhaps she was not fully recognized at that point in time and has come to be more revered as time has gone on. So Hildegard von Bingen, she lived from 1098 to 1179, and she's been called by her admirers one of the most important figures in the history of the Middle Ages and the greatest woman of her time. She was born in Rhineland, which is in modern Germany, and she was a Christian mystic, Benedictine abbess, composer, poet, and healer. When I say composer, I'm talking about music. She has music that persists and is recorded to this day. And so if you're interested in that, you can go and find her music even on iTunes now. But she was a revered healer, a prolific writer, including a medical encyclopedia called Physica and a medical handbook called Causae et Curae. And she was also a botanist and a renowned herbalist. So she took on a lot of the functions that the monks were also doing within the monasteries. The historians call her one of the most important scientists of her time, and perhaps the most influential woman scientist of the entire Middle Ages. The image on this slide is called Universal Man, and it is from one of Hildegard's works from around 1165. So her nickname was Sibyl of the Rhine. She was born a frail and sickly child. She was 10th in her aristocratic family, 10th in the line of children. And by tradition, she was consigned to serve God. So that was the tradition. If you were 10th, that was your lot in life, was to go to God. So she was confined in a Benedictine monastery from a very early age, sometime between the age of 8 and 14. At the age of 5, she had begun having visions, which she shared little of as she became aware they were not really normal. And so if she had shared them, I'm sure that she didn't get quite the reception she might have expected as a small child, and she learned to keep them to herself. So there's a belief that much of her sickness and that she had at that young age and her visions might be attributed to what we now know as a migraine with an aura. But given what those visions were, what the visions were in terms of source of information later in her life, it's hard to imagine them just being a source of migraines or a product of migraines. Her frequent bouts with illness eased after her teen years, but she continued having the visions. And so due to these visions, which were endorsed by the church, so this was, I mentioned there was a mysticism at that point in time that was endorsed by the church and a mysticism that was not. Her particular brand of mysticism was actually endorsed by the church. And the church endorsed her in documenting and considering those visions that she had as valid insights into God and into the scriptures. And so she was given great respect by the church, and also had influence beyond what a woman in the church would have generally had at that point in time, or even in the present day. After becoming abbess, she was given leave at about the age of 40 to take her nuns to a separate location from the monastery and to create a female-only environment. She was a prolific composer, which I've mentioned, and if interested, you can still find her music today. She composed over 70 chants and hymns. She was also a prolific writer in medicine and the natural world were only one area in which she wrote. She wrote a book called Natural Sciences, which was a catalog of over 250 plants and 170 animals. And all that she did was in service of God. She wrote extensively on cosmology, the overall natural order of the universe, which blended spirituality and mysticism with science, her visions and observations of the natural world. And given the dogma of the time in medicine, so we're again dogmatically adhering to Galen's theories of medicine at this point in time, she was given a great latitude actually in what she was relating in terms of medicine, because it was very far outside of that dogmatic perspective. And so she, because she was sort of studying medicine, but she was within the church. She was actually the visions that she drew a lot of her knowledge from were actually accorded great respect, which is really surprising coming from within the church at that point in time. So it's almost like she was operating from outside of the church, but everything that she did was in service of God, and she was very devoted to her religion and her spirituality, and so she had this real intellectual strength along with her insight, and she was able to bring those things together. Her book Physica was actually 9 books that were focused on the scientific and medicinal properties of various plants, stones, fish, reptiles, and animals, extensively documenting herbal remedies and becoming a standard medical school text during the Renaissance period, which was after her. She also studied the folk medicine of her own country and became known as a healer with great power. So she, like the monks in the monasteries, was bringing in the folk medicine into what she was convening of medical knowledge. And she stressed the power of prayer and belief in healing. Her medicinal and scientific writings don't claim to come from visions or divine authority, whereas a lot of her other writings do claim to come from visions or from information that was imparted to her by divine authority. But her medical and scientific writings are rooted in her experience, and her experience was in leading the medicinal herb garden and the infirmary at the monastery, as well as reading other sources. So, as with what I mentioned about her book Physica on the last slide, she had 9 sources of healing that she categorized: plants, elements, trees, stones, fish, birds, animals, reptiles, and metals. And each group contained different medicinal components. So her hallmark is to emphasize the vital connection between the green health of the natural world and the holistic health of the human person, including that person's spirituality. And so when she approached medicine as sort of a type of gardening, it was not just an analogy. Rather, it was that she understood that the plants and the elements of the garden were direct counterparts to the humors and the elements within the human body, and their imbalance led to illness and disease. And so she was incorporating a bit of this sort of humoral framework, although she didn't talk about it in the same terms that the Galen and Galen's followers did. Her connection to cosmology also influenced her view of healing, and she utilized a fair bit of astrology, particularly the phases of the moon, in her healing methods. And she, of course, connected all of this to her religion, and she posited that the original challenge to imbalance of the humors came from man's falling from grace in the Garden of Eden. And so I find this interesting if we think about our discussion of Ayurveda a while back, and the idea in Ayurveda that the original cause of illness is separation from the divine. This is actually quite a similar theory that she was working under as well. So we've come to the end of part 2. Here are your revision questions that cover part 1 and part 2. And your other food for thought: how important were the developments in medical theory and philosophy to the common person, maybe out in the countryside during the Middle Ages? So thank you for joining, and I will see you in part 3.